So I started writing a history tweet every day, and then about 2 weeks later, that's when the season started. But I was on a roll. Since COVID, every year I've been during the season trying to put out a history tweet, which I now call the Pitcher List Wayback Machine, um, to just something about maybe a player you haven't heard of, something interesting that happened, or if somebody is creating some content on Pitcher List, I'll try to make a tweet that sort of relates to that, maybe goes into it a little bit deeper, or brings up some players maybe that people didn't forget that haven't didn't don't know about, or maybe forgot about, or have only heard in passing. So what I thought I'd do for this one is explain what it takes and why I do this part on a fantasy baseball site, trying to bring up a little bit of baseball history. So that's what my thing's going to be about. And why do I do it? Well, first of all, the most important part is at the bottom. There's not a lot of math involved in doing baseball history. And there's people much smarter than me that's doing some great stuff on sabermetrics and making these fantasy stats and putting their leagues together and all of this. So I wanted to contribute a little bit by helpfully making people bringing some of that history that's back from baseball, bringing that in and making it relevant, and sort of seeing how some of the things are still the same. If you go through active baseball history, even from say 1880s, you will see articles about the players are lazy and don't play hard enough. The owners are cheap. Um, all of those types of things. Those arguments we have now, we still have. And some of the things that are starting to come back now that Major League Baseball and most teams have betting again that can happen, and you can bet from your phone inside of a stadium. Some of those arguments about why we let that happen that happened back in before, say 1900, 1910, 1920, the Black Sox scandal. Some of those arguments are starting to be coming back up in history, and it's been something I've been studying over this winter. I've been looking into that to say, and also I think people tend to forget some of the great things that happened. A lot of people don't realize baseball's been part of America since America has been part of this part of the world. It is something that you can follow back in baseball history or American history, and you can hear things about baseball, how it did, how it affected. You look at 1947 when they started to integrate the league. That's sort of when that conversation was starting to build up inside of America. So there's all this stuff that happened in our country and part of our history that's part of baseball that people tend to forget that. So I like want to try to help to do that. That's a part of baseball I love. Uh, and some of the things I did, because I used to hang around with a bunch, and I still hang around with a bunch of people who are much older than me, and they tell stories about baseball. And I just love to hear that, and I love to share those. So that's what I do. So, how do I do it? I have many, many, many leather brown books and all kinds of books, and I can read sometimes 3 to 4 books a, a week, maybe 20 a month sometimes, depending on the size of the book. That's usually about older players. In fact, for the when Bob Uecker passed away, and I put that article together for Pitcher List, I related to the fact that Bob Uecker had a book called Pitcher in the Rye. That was about the time when I was in high school, a long time ago, that we had to read Catcher in the Rye for as an assignment. So I read Bob Uecker's book and did a report on it, got myself a detention, and actually sent Bob Uecker a letter. Um, I sent a letter to the Brewers asking if Bob Uecker would be nice enough to write a book called The Mice and Men, because we had to do it next year. So I fell in love with baseball history then, because that was the first book I read about a non-baseball star. We'll say it's Bob Uecker. He was known more back then for what he did on TV, maybe hosting uh, the Tonight Show, something like that, and hearing all these stories. And I wanted to hear these stories that the stars normally didn't talk about. Then I read Ball Four by Jim Bouton, got myself another detention for doing a book report on that, because I mentioned too much about the stuff that I shouldn't have talked about. So I've got all these books together. Baseball Reference is a huge help. Saber, I'm a member of Saber. I go through, read the Saber articles. Retro Sheet is great because if you want to try to find things that maybe unusual happened on a specific date, and since I try to get the history list as much as I can to say on this date, I can go back and look to see what's something interesting that happened in this date. I do a lot of research on baseball, so I go through newspaper articles, I go through the archives, I listen to baseball games all the time. uh, I don't get MLB TV. I get the MLB audio and listen to all the radio announcers, and those radio announcers and those former players tell all these stories that happened back when they were then, or relay stories. I write those down. As you can see, I've got my coffee and my keyboard and everything there. I write these notes down when I'm taking those and put those in the note cards. Uh, Look at old baseball cards and then do a lot of queries to do that. And during the season, I'll have up top of my computer. It drives my wife nuts. A multicolor post-it notes of try to things that I try to keep together to try to do a whole bunch of things. So that's sort of the process. I spend a lot of time doing that. So I have no time to do math. And I let the other people that are smarter than me do that. So for today, I figured I would show you some of the notes that I put together. Um, and how these things come together and get turned into a tweet. This is a note card that I had for January 31st. And Joe Swell, who played for the Indians at the time, back in 1920 is when he started. And then he eventually went to the Yankees. He was the original Tony Gwynn. And today, on this date, he was elected by the veterans into the Baseball Hall of Fame along with Al Lopez, another target, and Mon-Fri, who was a former Giants pitcher. So they got announced that they were elected into there. He was Tony Gwynn, like I said before, he was Tony Gwynn. Those numbers there that you put up there, the 17, 20, 17, 13, 4, 6, 9, 8, that's how many times each year that he struck out. So he struck out 114 times for his 14-year career, where he averaged about 620 at bats or plate appearances per season. And then I pulled up his numbers next to Tony Gwynn, and you can see Tony Gwynn was obviously the better player, played longer. Gwynn had a 20 plus seasons. Swell only played for 14, but it's just 114 strikeouts in his career and he used a 40-ounce bat. So what I do is as I put these together and I bring these up, I start writing little bits of information to turn it into things. And Swell had the bad position, we'll put, of, remember, he played for Cleveland in 1920. What happened in 1920? Well, Cleveland did win their first World Series, held by Trez Speaker and all of those great players. Ray Chapman was hit by a ball by Carl May. He passed away. So he was the shortstop. Swell was a shortstop. They brought in who they brought in somebody to play to replace Chapman, who had passed away. He got hurt, so they pulled up Swell as a 21-year-old rookie who had 354, 346 plate appearances in the minor leagues, Class A minor leagues in New Orleans. Called him up on September 6th to be in a pennant run as a rookie, and he's the youngest position player ever to play in the World Series. He did fairly well. He batted pretty well. He did strike out a little bit, but it's coming into that situation, and that's what he had to do, which I had to be tough. Because also Ray Chapman was the best friend of Trev Speaker, who was the center fielder manager. So he had to come in and was basically replacing his manager's best friend in a pennant run. So it's a difficult start to his career. And he eventually went on and in 1932, I believe it was, he won a championship with the Yankees when he moved over. He only struck up once in the World Series, and he was known as Gentleman Joe. because he was the way he played and the type of person he was just really impressed people. People loved him. The city of Cleveland loved him. You can read about him back in the stories that are back there in Cleveland at League Park and everything. But he also went, since he was from Alabama, was born in Alabama, he went back to Alabama and started coaching college down there at Alabama and won an SEC championship in 1968. So not only was Swell very much like Tony Gwynn, he had sort of the same, he was the same type of person, a very personal person, very loved, and went into coaching. So I just I tell people, and if you follow me on Twitter, I when people talk about Tony Gwynn, I go, yeah, but he's no Joe Swell. To try to bring that up, but that I would take this information and then I would write it into a tweet, or a message in the send because I'll also be on Blue Sky this year too, and then wait from some of the great content that comes out from Pitcher List. Sometimes what happens is they don't. Somebody will say write about something else, and I'm like, I know a different story. So now I've got to save this till next year, which does happen from time to time on side this. So that's sort of what I do every day, Monday through Friday, or Monday through Friday and the weekends, just about every day. There are some times I miss, like this year, um, in the town that I live in, which now happens to be have a Hall of Famer that resides in our town. Thank you, Tom Hamilton, for finally winning the Ford Frick Award. We got hit with a tornado as I was getting ready to send out a tweet. So that was the reason. Um, I did miss a few tweets this year. So let's take a look. One thing here that I want to talk about is, as you can tell, it's very easy to go down rabbit holes. I was reading this book. I um, study linguistics and the philosophy of language quite a bit. And J.L. Austin is somebody that I follow and I've read his work, and they came out with a biography about him. This is how rabbit holes start. Found found out one of the things is, as reading in his book, he came over to do some work in the United States in the 50s, and he fell in love with baseball to the point where he would play pickup games, usually softball games, because he's a little bit older at the time. But he fell in love with it, and he started using his baseball rules to go and do some of his research. So he took in baseball rules to do as part of his research. And I found that interesting because I used him as the basis in some of his things, especially as something called performance utterances, about that umpires don't make calls, they make history, talking about if we're going to be changing the rules of how we use video and new technology to enhance what the umpire does, some ways to do that. And I included that article inside there. You guys can go and read it. I am tooting my horn a little bit on this one. But then I also found out that during World War II, he's from England. He is a Brit. He went into the military, like many people did, but they used his intelligence and they put him in the intelligence office to start doing some work. One of the things he started doing was helping to prepare for invasions of England when they had to go and try to reclaim England from Germany. So he would start looking for landing patterns, places where they would be good for the Allied forces to come in and do an invasion. Won accolades for that. And one of the things he helped plan was D-Day. So he was involved in helping pick it, pick where they were going to, invade, where D-Day was going to be, what time it would happen, also on where you would place people and do the military strategy, how you would have people come up, where you would have your people back offering, support as people go in. Inside, during D-Day, there was 7 people who were baseball players. They were in the minor leagues at the time, they weren't professionals. 5 of them did not come back from D-Day, 2 players did. One of those players that did was Yogi Berra. So Yogi Berra was a tail gunner during the D-Day invasion. He did get injured and he did get a Purple Heart. I found it interesting that, first of all, it's Yogi Berra, one of my favorite players. And there's so many stories about Yogi Berra that I don't think a lot of people understand, in part because as Yogi moved away from being a coach or a player, he got really well known for the way he inflicted his own personality into language with his yogiisms and things like that. But what I found interesting is that J.L. Austin, who helped, you know, basically helped decide where Yogi Berra would be, that made it so that he could, play baseball and become this great player. When J.L. Austin came over here and fell in love with baseball, and he was in a lot of times in the East Coast, he probably enjoyed listening to the what happened with Yogi Berra and all of that. And they probably didn't even know that they both had this major tie into this part of history, and they did not know that. And we are lucky to have all of the things Yogi Berra that may not have happened because of this English philosophy English philosophy person that did a lot of things. And it's just funny how the interconnected of this all does that. This was about 2 months worth of research as I did this. And part of it is because I love stories about Yogi Berra when he grew up, and I'm going down the Yogi Berra rabbit hole. I don't care what it says down at the bottom. When he grew up, Joe Girardi was lived across the street from in St. Louis, and Joe Buck, Jack Buck's or Jack Buck, Joe Buck's dad, lived on the same in the same neighborhood in St. Louis. So these three Hall of Fame people basically were around each other as they grow up. Branch Rickey picked Joe instead of Yogi when he was the GM of the Cardinals, because what he wanted to do is when he moved to Brooklyn, he wanted to bring Yogi there and would have teamed him up with Jackie Robinson. But that didn't work out because the Yankees took him, and then we were lucky enough that in '43, when Yogi signed up for the Navy, um, the Yankees had already put him on there. J.L. Austin has to go through. And then we have all these great stories, not only of Yogi Berra, who I think people tend to forget how great he was. In 21 seasons, uh, he won 10 World Series as a player, 3 as a coach. The man just won championships. He was Tom Brady before there was Tom Brady, and he's in baseball. But Yogi Berra also built relationships with people, and I think people tend to forget it. He had a great relationship with Jackie Robinson. Their families got together. They almost got to be teammates. It didn't work out, but they still grew uh, into that. And he was also very friendly when he opened up his Yogi Berra Baseball Museum, which I think is part of Montclair University up there in New York. Larry Dolby was a frequent visitor there. So Yogi Berra, this great player, was also such a great human being that those people that came in to integrate baseball at the time, he embraced them. He brought them in. And if you go to Yogi Berra's the website for Yogi Berra's museum, he has a story about uh, relationships and respecting people and things like that. There's a course that they'll give to students that's based on the relationship between Yogi Berra and Jackie Robinson. The interesting part is when Obama was president, somebody gave him a letter of that famous World Series picture where Jackie Robinson slid in. Jackie Robinson was saved. Yogi Berra disagreed, and there's that famous picture. Jackie Robinson and Yogi Berra and their wives would greet each other and say, "Hi, how you doing?" He was safe. No, I'm sorry, he was out. Yogi Berra sent a letter to Obama or a picture to Obama, same copy of that. He signed it and said he was out. These are the stories I don't think people hear a lot about, especially with some of our players, of how well they got together, but just how much of a good person Yogi Berra was. And we have, in part, to think of it, some British dude, which I just love. So there's more, and like I said, there's a lot of American history. These are some authors, people in literature, or people famous in the United States, maybe as we'll call them intellectuals, for the lack of a better word, who were huge baseball fans. It's Walt Whitman. If you remember, Walt Whitman is not recent history. He is very old history. Leaves of Grass, the stuff you had to read in high school that bored you to death. Mark Twain, in fact, he wrote a short story about an Englishman traveling back in time and teaching people how to play baseball. John Rawls is another philosopher who used baseball rules quite a bit and some of that information to do some of his studies and to talk about things. And he was a huge baseball fan. The famous beat writer for On the Road and all of that, Jack Kerouac. Not only did he just love baseball, he created his own fantasy baseball league that he played starting with his brother when they were young until he passed away. He made up entire seasons of players and played rotisserie league type fantasy leagues and wrote about them, wrote press releases, made trades, did all this as he was also writing some of the, at the time at the beat, writing some of the stuff the Bohemian and the Beats and the hippies were reading. And here it was, this guy that just loved baseball, but it didn't really come into his writing. It was almost like his secret thing that he kept together, which we don't do that. And then coming out, there's Rod Sterling, as you can tell by my lovely background, that Rod Sterling was a huge baseball fan, and I was lucky enough to talk to his daughter about it as I was doing some research for some other things. And she remembers they were out in LA and they would drive to go to the grocery store and do things like that. And her dad was always in his car, the cigarette always in his hand, Vince Scully on the radio, and he would pound his fist as they were doing good or they were doing bad. And he did put baseball in a couple of his Twilight Zone episodes, which I have an article there on Picture List if you want to go and read that. I also talk about the Jack Kerouac, and Kerouac was leaving on the road about the same time that Jackie Robinson was coming in to integrate baseball in 1947. And it was around the same week that they came in. So Jackie Robinson came in to start his baseball career. Jack Kerouac left out to start his literary career, and they both did it from Brooklyn, and I speculate that they might have left and came in the same platform. But Rod Sterling even went so far as to create a teleplay about the Cincinnati Reds. I remember this is back during the Red Scare and all of that stuff and communism. So he wrote about a Russian spy that came over to was Russian spy wanted to become turn himself in. So he obviously went to the Cincinnati Reds thinking that they would be that because they thought he was communist to do that. And he wrote a story and he included things about that. And it was recently the script was found and somebody on made a teleplay of it, a radio play of it. So, th- and then Jane Austen wrote about baseball in one of her books, to give it the name there, around 1803. And you can go back to even finding references of baseball into the 1780s. You can read a book. It's called Baseball Before We Knew It by Dan Block, I believe it is, or Don Block up there, and find out that this baseball history has come up through all that. So that's part of the reason why I want to try to bring that out and bring those things into things, is because I just find it interesting that not only is baseball part of just this neat thing that we like to do that brings people together that lets us argue, but it's intertwined quite a bit into the history of America, and that's the things that I really find interesting. So we'll talk about, and I will talk about some of my favorite tweets uh, that I did for this year, and there was quite a few that I loved. And once again, Joe Swill was somebody that I was a stand for quite a bit. But I went through and I did approximately 197 tweets. So 197 history lessons during the baseball season. And a couple of those did include some history lessons about the Kia Tigers, because this year as a baseball fan, or last season as a baseball fan, the Guardians were in the playoffs. The Kia Tigers, who are my Korean fan that I follow, they won the championship. And living in Northeast Ohio, we have an independent league called the Lake Erie Crushers. They made it to the playoffs. Ohio State won. The Cavs are doing great. And then there's the Browns. But so I hit every 31 current teams. I'm except I didn't get the Marlins. I'm really sorry, Marlins fans. I didn't have anything that came up about them. I had a couple that I was going to do, but they didn't come up. So I'm going to try to leave that. I also went to 15 teams that are longer part of this. Seattle Pilots are one of them, but also some American Association teams, things like that. Some of my favorite ones were Grover Cleveland, and he pitched both games of a doubleheader, and they were complete games. We went into a doubleheader, and you only needed one person on your pitching staff, and I had to go back and look to see how many times has this happened. So I went and I did some research to find out that the National League was really the team that used to do that, but that's also because the National League goes back to 1876. The American League is 1901. So we can see already some of the trends that would happen in terms of how much pitchers are used. Even if we go back to the 1900s, where we think, oh, these pitchers used to all do it, it used to be that pitchers pitched for the day, in some cases. So 35 times it happened in National League, 10 times it happened in the American League. And Joe McGinty was the last person to do it, and he did it in 1903. And then Old Hoss Radden, if you go and look, he was a pitcher back in the 1880s that just pitched all the time, and everything in there. So part of why I like this one was because you can see that trend of pitchers weren't pitching as much. Now the rules were changing. Sound familiar? The rules are always changing in baseball. But as those rules were changing, pitchers did things differently. Sometimes pitchers, especially in some of these things where you're looking at they pitch 600 innings, they might have been throwing underhand from 55 feet. As it went back and as they were allowed to do that, and as they learned to throw curveballs, so as we start seeing that they're putting more pressure on the pitchers, that's sort of how those rules changed a little bit. So we can look, especially if we know, understand history a little bit, we understand how those changes are coming. Then we can look a little bit forward as we're making little changes now. And obviously now we have it where a complete game is a rarity. We have relief pitchers that we really didn't used to have. And I did talk about some relief pitchers that were coming up in the 50s, which were, you didn't have a lot of relief pitchers, but you had people that were used more like Mike Marshall's and Rich Gossage at the start of his career, where they were pitching maybe three, four times, and they might pitch four or five times in a week sometimes, and get maybe almost two games worth of work as a relief pitcher as it started to come down. But I think part of what some of the research shows and some of the things I try to show in my tweets is as players get better, as we get healthier, as those uh, training regimens get better, as we learn how that body works and how we do that, we're not just making pitchers better. What we are is now taxing them um, to use their body as much. And that's part of what happens in there. So when we look at people like the Jake Denomes, who I know that Nick loves, and how he hasn't been able to stay healthy, one thing you can also look back is what some other pitchers that maybe didn't have the careers but started off their careers like this. And one of those that I had mentioned this year was a favorite of mine, Herb Score, who came out like a bat out of hell. Sorry, Nick. In 1956, he was the Rookie of the Year. He led the American League in strikeouts. And then the next year, he had like a 5.6 WAR, I think, his first year. The next year, he was a 7.3 WAR. And then his third year, he got hit in the head on a batted ball and never was able to come back. He started having arm injuries. because mainly, I think because he was trying to get himself in a defensive position a little bit quicker. I don't think he did it on purpose. I think it was a just something that came up in way he did that, and he started changing his motion, and he hurt his arm, and he can never get his arm and his shoulder back into shape, which wouldn't happen now. That wouldn't happen. So maybe Herb Score could have continued that career, or maybe he would have had a path like Jacob Moan, who this guy's great when he get on the field, but but the problem is his biggest problem is staying healthy because of the way that he pitches. He's taxing his body to the point that we do that, and that's what I think. But Nick would probably be able to tell me more about that inside that. But the interesting part about Herb Score, once again, another rabbit hole, is Herb Score made it so that the Cleveland Guardians or the Indians at the time did not need a starting left-handed pitcher. They had a top starting left-handed pitcher. So they were able to trade somebody by the name of Dick Tomanak, along with some other guy, his roommate, Roger Bears, who may have heard of them, to the Kansas City A's. Dick Tomanak, and I know how to say that name properly, lived in the same town I lived in. He went to the same high school I lived in. He was signed from high school to play for the Cleveland Indians. And his dad, we'll put it this way, the Tomanaks have a street named after them in my town. So his dad, who was at the bar, said, "Hey, my son ever starts for Cleveland. When my son starts for the Cleveland Indians, I'm going to walk down to the stadium and watch him pitch." We lived 20 miles away from Cleveland, uh, and like most people in our town, not only did they say, "I'm going to do this," when it happened, he said, "Hold my beer," and actually walked down to the town to do that. So Dick Tomanak who was pitched on the 1954 Indians. You may have heard of them. They did quite well, except in the World Series. They He hurt his arm, allowing Herb Score to come up and do that. And I never got the opportunity to spot. I spoke to some people in the Tomanak family, but never get Dick because he was very sick when I was doing this research. But like I said, it's interesting to see these come together. And there's all kinds of these stories for different teams. And I know a lot about Cleveland, and I'm starting to do some research on finding ones of some of the other teams. Another thing that came up where, and here we are, where somebody did their Major League morning news on a Sunday for Pitcher List, and they talked about a record that wouldn't be broken. And I said, I've got a better one. In 1896, the Baltimore Orioles of the National League win their fifth straight game in 2 days. Yes, they paid a triple header and a double header consecutive days and won both of them. They also went over the period. They went 9-0-1 over like a 10-day period, or yeah, 5-game sweep. But that was over. They had played double headers between in there also. So like in 5 days, they won 10 games. With a day off in between there, I believe. But it's these things that won't be broken anymore. Just the fact that there have been triple headers that we don't talk about, and remembering those. And I think this is something that Major League Baseball should think about bringing back, not between teams, but three teams could play a triple header and each play each other and get some time off. And I think that would be interesting to do inside that. That's one of the weird things I can do that I think about when I look back into these things. Um, let's see what we got. Whoop, did not mean to do that. So some of the other tweets that I brought up this year that I thought were interesting, which I started looking at players. I started to try to find players back in history that maybe were forgotten, or since I did some research about World War II and the players that unfortunately didn't come back and the ones that did come back, I started looking at players from the 40s that had their careers shortened because they were in World War II. You looked at people that were maybe 18, 17, 18, 19 years old when World War II started, And yes, there was a lot of current players that signed up, and many of them did go over and fight, like Bob Feller, his famous Ted Williams, and those types. But there was a lot of players that still had not started their careers yet, or were in the minor leagues, went for 4 years to there, and then came back and started to regain their baseball. But they had missed 4 years of that young prime time that to do uh, to build themselves up. They still had to deal with whatever many of the players had problems dealing with what they had, what happened to them while they were in the military. And one of them is this guy that I found, Farias Payne, who played about 11 years. But since he was in the military, he did not start until 1926. And he played for Philadelphia and then for the White Sox. But he was 26 when he started. As he played, he was a pretty good player, but he didn't hit a lot. But over his career, of the 11 years he played, 10 of them, his on base percentage was 400 or above, except for 1 year where it was 399.45 or something like that. He was the player you would look for now. I've talked to people. It used to be if you knew if you hit 300, you had a good shot for a Hall of Fame. Well, now if your on base percentage is around 400, you'd think you have a good shot for the Hall of Fame. He did this in the late 40s, early 50s. So I started looking and started talking about some players and started about that would play good now. It would be great players now. But back in the day, oh, you got on base a lot and you only hit, you weren't a top home run hitter. You didn't strike out a lot. Those players were sort of pushed aside for people that could take the big swing and the thing like that. So a lot more that I'll be doing this year is trying to focus on those players who I'd say were played baseball in the wrong era. So that's another thing that I'm looking forward to. So let's see, we're getting right here about the time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go off and maybe me and Nick can talk a little bit here. But I'm ready for 2005. I spent most of the winter getting together some more information. I'm going to be starting probably about the same time pitchers and catchers report. I'll be on X now, which is at Sid Finch, and I'll be on Blue Sky, which is sidfinch.bluesky.social. I'm still doing more research. Oh, I still got 15 minutes? Okay, fine. I'll keep going here. I'll go back to, I'll still be doing some research, but I like to try to incorporate what other people maybe would want to learn or maybe would do that. I'd also like this year, I'm going to be starting and talking to people in some of the pitcher list staff to find out. I am a huge Dwayne Kuiper fan. When I grew up, I started loving baseball. Dwayne Kuiper was the face of the Cleveland Guardians. Everybody, a lot of kids had his number. So there's always those players. We always love our great players, you know, the top tier players, some of the best players in the league. But everybody has that guy that you just like because you like. Right now in Cleveland, you can look at Austin Hedges, the backup catcher that can barely hit. We keep signing him because what he does on that field and how he connects to not only the leadership he has for the clubhouse, but how he connects to the fans and how the fans love him do mean a lot to do that. And Cleveland is notorious for making sure they have catchers that can't hit. But so I'm going to start looking for that. So if you're listening or if you see this and there is what I'll call my the greatest player that ever lived and doesn't deserve to be anywhere near the Hall of Fame type player, contact me and I will incorporate that into some of the things I did. Some of the other things I'm going to try to do what I did a few years ago, which is I went through and did a series of tweets about players that that played, grew up, and played in Lorraine County, which included people like well, we had Dick Tomanak. He was actually we had a couple current major league players whose names I can't remember. We had Fleetwood Moses Walker because he played at Oberlin Prep, which is a town in here in Lorraine County, part of Oberlin College. He played and he started a year after uh, Lee Richmond played for Oberlin College. Lee Richmond was the first um, pitcher to throw a perfect game in, in MLB history for what they consider to be 1866. Uh, Fleetwood Walker was before Jackie Robinson, the last black player that played in the American League before Cap Anderson refused to play the game into them, and Cap Anson, who is a great player and has a great history. And if you look at Cubs history, he's all up there. But he helped collude, was one of the people that helped collude to make sure that the Fleetwood Moses Walkers wouldn't play in the game anymore, and they would somehow have to try to reintegrate this great game of baseball. Interesting story about Lee Richmond. And now we go to another one of my favorite players that everybody forgets about. Eddie Posh was a pitcher for Cleveland. He was elected in by the Veterans Committee in 1997. And if you follow me on Twitter, I already made a comment about this. Uh, During the 1908 pennant series in October, Eddie Josh threw a 74 pitch perfect game where he only struck out 3 people. This is back in 1908, where you can pretty much average your team was going to give you about an error, 2 errors a game. He pitched a perfect game, didn't walk anybody, put the ball in play for 24 other batters to get them out. He did this pitching against the White Sox, who were Cleveland, the White Sox, and uh, the Tigers were all in a three-way within like 3 games of each other in October. So this is a pennant race. Josh threw the 4th perfect game in Major League Baseball history. He did it against Ed Walsh, whose record at the time was 39-13 in the heart of a playoff season with only 74 pitches. So when a lot of people come and say he's got a complete game in 90 pitches, that's like Greg Maddux, I'm like, yeah, but it's not as impressive as what Addie Josh did. Addie Josh had a short career, and he was known for being he was considered the king of the pitchers back in about 1908. In fact, at the end of Cy Young's career, he was back with Cleveland. He was like the number 4, number 3, number 4 starter for a staff where Addie Josh was the lead starter. So people have asked me if Josh was so good, how come he never won a Cy Young award? Because he played with him at that. Addie Josh unfortunately passed away when at the beginning of the 1911 season. Right around there, he passed away. He had meningitis. He did have a history of being ill. He once pitched a season with malaria, and he didn't. He was he was only like one of the top 5 pitchers then when he had malaria when he pitched. So he had passed away early. Interest, 2 interesting things about Addie Josh is he lived in Toledo. Lee Richmond, who pitched the first perfect game, became a math teacher out in Toledo. Addie Josh's son had Lee Richmond as a math teacher, and Lee Richmond went up to Addie Josh's son. Yeah, I hear your dad's a baseball player. He threw a perfect game. He threw the 4th one. I threw the first one. This isn't going to help your grades, which had to be lovely for the young man at that point in time. But Addie Josh also, when he passed away, he was so beloved in baseball. People do this, is that when he passed away, the American League teams wanted to do something to help the family. Because at the time, if Addie Josh was a writer and an engineer outside of baseball. Their contracts are not like they were now. They had to have second jobs. So the baseball players wanted to do something for Addie Josh and his family, for Addie Josh's family, to help them so they could go there. So first of all, the American League president was scheduled games for Addie Josh's funeral, the Tigers were going to refuse to play. We're not going to play. We're just forfeit us. The other team was like, I forget who they were playing. We're like, well, we're not playing either. I think it was White Sox. We got to go to this funeral. We got to go to that. Think of it. Teams were willing to forfeit games so they can go to this funeral. Another a major league player at the time, Billy Sunday, who eventually became a well-known evangelist, was the one that did the eulogy for Eddie Josh. And then those players came together and said, we're going to have a benefit game so that we can raise some money for Cleveland. We're going to have it in Cleveland at League Park. Ty Cobb was one of the big people that put this together and said, I will be there. So we had somewhat of the first All-Star game during that time. And the Cleveland Indians played All-Stars from the American League. Christy Matthews was there. Trez Speaker was on that team. Ty Cobb was on there. And when Cobb came down to Cleveland to play the game, they lost his Tiger uniform. So there he played in a Cleveland jersey. So there are photos out there of Ty Cobb wearing a Cleveland away jersey inside there, come from that. But I don't think people realize that Addie Josh was this great pitcher that passed away. And he was very much like Greg Maddux. So once again, like I said, I go down rabbit holes when I do these things, when I love to do that. But it's interesting to see that there are certain types of pitchers, and particularly great pitchers that come up that seem to have that same, um, smart, intelligent, not the fastest, but was able to put his pitches wherever he want and can do things. That was Addie Josh. That's also Greg Maddux. And looking into those, and that's part of the reason why I want to bring these tweets up, is if you like Greg Maddux, go read about this guy. If you like Tony Gwynn, go read about this guy. If you want to hear some interesting stories about how players used to react, Joe Swell, who I talked about at the beginning, two of his brothers made it to the major leagues, and his one cousin. And his one cousin, Rip Swell, was a pitcher in the 1940s for the National League for the 1946 All-Star game. He's the one that threw the Ippis pitch that Ted Williams smacked for a home run inside of the game. So I'm half tempted at some point in time to write a book, which is just degrees of separation from certain players and how they can get all tied together. We can tie Tony Gwynn to Joe Swell because they were very similar players and do that. But that's what I hope what I try to do when I put these history tweets is try to bring that interest in baseball, not just in the community that's created by fantasy sports, by having your leagues, by having your arguments, but just showing how much of baseball history is back there and bring some of those things back, from there and having those discussions of, you know, some of those players like Thurman Munson, who once again, even though he's a Yankee, is one of my favorite players because Thurman Munson was an Akron Zip, and I live in a part of the area where, when we come to Akron, Thurman Munson is the best professional player that came from Akron. And then there's this guy called LeBron something that also came from Akron. But tying those stories together and bringing that together is one of the things I try to do, and help people do that, because with all the information we have now, all that stuff that's out there that you can learn about a players, we don't really have that back from the time when, if in the 1910s, if you were in, say, Washington, or playing for if Brooklyn was your team or the New York Giants was your team, you probably, unless there was a World Series, never seen Ty Cobb play. So those stories that we talk about, think about it now, looking at your teams and never being able to see some of these players ever, because you didn't have TV, you really didn't have radio that would go that far. The only thing you would know were those teams that came together. With that team came and played your team, and you could afford to go see that. That was the only way you might have seen Babe Ruth play. Well, unless you were in the you were losing in the World Series against the Yankees. But if you were a Reds fan back in that time, you probably never got to see a team, somebody from Cleveland play. So Reds fans never seen Trev Speaker play. They never, seen Matt Lahoji play, things like that, because they didn't come to get there. So I want to try to tell those stories, those things, because those things didn't come up. So that's really what I'm trying to do, and I hope people like it. And I hope you come and engage. And like Nick says, I always include some of the great content in Picture List before you have to hear me read my typos and everything like that.